Mr. James Wilson stood in his front yard on a quiet Sunday morning, carefully tending to his growing collection of roses and dahlias. At 68 years old, his dark skin had gained a distinguished softness that came with age, though his posture remained as straight as an arrow. The morning dew still clung to the grass around his feet as he worked, finding peace in the simple act of gardening. The suburban neighborhood of Pine Creek hadn't been his first choice for retirement. After losing Sarah, his wife of 42 years, to cancer last spring, the shared dream of retiring to a beachside cottage no longer felt right. Instead, he chose this predominantly white neighborhood because of its affordability and proximity to his only daughter, Michelle, who lived 30 minutes away. Every morning, Mr. Wilson followed the same routine he'd maintained for the past 4 decades. He woke at 5 a.m., meditated for an hour in his small home dojo, and performed his kata exercises, flowing movements that had become as natural as breathing after his many years of martial arts training. The neighborhood was usually silent at that hour, which suited him perfectly. The previous owners had left the garden in a sorry state, but Mr. Wilson saw it as an opportunity. Working with his hands in the soil reminded him of his childhood in Georgia, where his grandmother had taught him about plants and patience. Everything worth doing takes time, she used to say, words that had guided him through his martial arts journey from student to master. In his new neighborhood, Mr. Wilson kept mostly to himself. He waved politely to passing neighbors, but few stopped to chat. Some would cross the street when they saw him coming, while others would hurry past his house, clutching their belongings closer. He noticed these things but chose not to let them bother him. After living through the civil rights movement and experiencing far worse, these small acts of prejudice were like paper cuts to an old warrior. The inside of Mr. Wilson's house told the story of a life well lived. Photographs lined the walls, images of him in his martial arts gi at various tournaments, standing proudly with his students, and precious moments with Sarah and their daughter. In his study, certificates and black belts hung alongside family portraits, each one marking a milestone in his 40-year journey as a martial artist and instructor. His favorite spot was a converted garage, now a small but well-maintained private dojo. The polished wooden floors, mirrored walls, and simple decorations reflected the discipline and minimalism he'd learned from his own masters. Here, every morning and evening, he continued his personal training, his movements still fluid and precise despite his age. The neighbors often heard strange sounds coming from his garage, sharp kies, martial arts shouts, and the rhythmic thud of hands and feet against a heavy bag. Some had started rumors about the mysterious old black man and his unusual activities, but Mr. Wilson paid them no mind. Peace came from within, as he always taught his students. That particular Sunday morning, as Mr. Wilson worked in his garden, he noticed a group of teenage boys watching him from across the street. They weren't being particularly subtle about it, laughing and pointing in his direction. He recognized them as local kids who often roamed the neighborhood on their skateboards, led by a tall boy with spiky blonde hair who seemed to carry himself with misplaced arrogance. Mr. Wilson simply continued his gardening, treating their presence like the morning breeze, acknowledged but not engaged with. As he carefully pruned his roses, his mind wandered to his old dojo in the city, where he'd spent decades teaching martial arts to troubled youth. He'd seen plenty of angry young men transform their lives through discipline and respect. These boys reminded him of many former students, all bluster and bravado, hiding their insecurities behind tough exteriors. The teens eventually moved on, but something in their body language told Mr. Wilson this wouldn't be the last he'd see of them. Still, he remained unworried. Years of martial arts training had taught him that true strength lay in knowing when not to fight, and true wisdom in understanding that everyone, even misguided youth, deserved a chance to learn and grow. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mr. Wilson gathered his gardening tools and headed inside. He had his afternoon meditation to look forward to, followed by his evening kata practice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same calm dignity that had carried him through all of life's storms. The trouble began gradually, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Brad Thompson and his 3 friends, Mike, Chris, and Durek, had grown bored with their usual routines of skateboarding and loitering at the local mall. They found a new source of entertainment in harassing Mr. Wilson, the elderly black man who had recently moved into their neighborhood. It started with small acts of disrespect. Whenever Mr. Wilson would walk to the local grocery store, the teens would follow at a distance, making loud racist jokes and comments just within earshot. Brad, with his spiky blonde hair and expensive clothes, always led these harassments. At 17, he was the oldest of the group and came from one of the wealthiest families in Pine Creek. One evening, while Mr. Wilson was tending to his garden, the boys rode past on their skateboards, deliberately knocking over his trash cans. The garbage scattered across his freshly mowed lawn, but Mr. Wilson simply began cleaning up the mess without showing any sign of disturbance. His calm response seemed to irritate Brad even more. "Look at him, acting all high and mighty," Brad sneered to his friends, loud enough for Mr. Wilson to hear. This neighborhood was better before people like him moved in. The other boys laughed, though Chris looked uncomfortable. He was the newest member of their group and still hadn't fully embraced their cruel behavior. However, fear of being excluded kept him from speaking up. The harassment escalated over the next few weeks. Mr. Wilson would wake up to find racist slurs spray painted on his driveway, which he would quietly clean off before his morning meditation. The teens would throw empty soda cans into his garden, crushing his carefully tended flowers. Through it all, Mr. Wilson maintained his dignity, never showing anger or reporting them to the authorities. What the teens didn't know was that Mr. Wilson documented everything. His phone was filled with videos of their acts of vandalism, captured by the discreet security cameras he had installed after the first incident. He wasn't planning to use the footage for revenge. Rather, he saw it as a potential teaching tool for when the right moment came. Brad's anger toward Mr. Wilson grew with each passing day. The old man's perpetual calmness infuriated him, reminding him of his own father's disappointment in his behavior. Unknown to his friends, Brad was struggling with his parents' recent divorce and his father's remarriage to a younger woman. His racism and bullying were outlets for pain he couldn't express otherwise. One Tuesday afternoon, the teen spotted Mr. Wilson walking home from the grocery store, carrying 2 heavy bags. Brad saw an opportunity for escalation and nudged his friends to follow. As they trailed behind the elderly man, they began their usual taunts, but this time with more aggression in their voices. "Hey, old man," Brad called out, his voice echoing in the empty street. "Didn't anyone tell you this is a restricted neighborhood?" Mr. Wilson continued walking, his pace steady and unhurried. The plastic bags creaked in his hands as he moved, containing ingredients for the dinner he had planned to cook that evening. The teens grew bolder, circling around him on their skateboards like sharks. They knocked one of his grocery bags, sending oranges rolling across the pavement. Still, Mr. Wilson's expression remained neutral as he bent down to retrieve his scattered groceries. "What's wrong?" Brad taunted, emboldened by Mr. Wilson's apparent vulnerability. "Too scared to say anything. Maybe you should go back where you came from." Chris hung back, watching nervously as Brad edged closer to Mr. Wilson. The tension in the air was palpable, like electricity before a lightning strike. Even Mike and Derek, usually eager participants in Brad's schemes, seemed unsure about the situation's escalating nature. What none of them realized was that beneath Mr. Wilson's calm exterior, his trained eyes were constantly assessing their movements, positions, and body language. 40 years of martial arts training had taught him to read situations like this with precision. He noticed Brad's aggressive stance, the uncertainty in Chris's posture, and the growing hesitation in Mike and Derek's expressions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the suburban street, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Brad, frustrated by Mr. Wilson's continued silence, made a decision that would change everything. He decided to get physical. What happened next would shock everyone involved, but not for the reasons they expected. The empty parking lot of Pine Creek Market became the stage for what would happen next. Mr. Wilson had just finished placing his recovered groceries back into their bags when Brad and his friends surrounded him in a tight circle. The evening shadows stretched long across the asphalt, and the fluorescent lights from the market cast an eerie glow over the scene. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Brad's voice cracked with anger as he stepped closer to Mr. Wilson. "Walking around our neighborhood like you own the place, ignoring us like we're nothing." Mr. Wilson finally turned to face the teenager, his movements calm and deliberate. For the first time, he spoke directly to them, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Young man," he said softly, "the path you're choosing right now leads nowhere good." His response seemed to surprise the teens, especially Brad, who had expected fear or anger. Instead, they found themselves facing a man whose eyes held a quiet strength they hadn't noticed before. Despite his age, Mr. Wilson stood perfectly straight, his grocery bags held steadily at his sides. What the teens couldn't know was that beneath his simple brown sweater and khaki pants, Mr. Wilson's body was hardened by years of rigorous training. His seemingly frail frame concealed muscles that had been conditioned through decades of martial arts practice. As a seventh-degree black belt in Shotokan Karate, he had spent 40 years not just mastering techniques, but teaching troubled youth how to find their way through discipline and respect. Chris, standing slightly apart from the others, noticed something different about the old man's stance. Though Mr. Wilson appeared relaxed, there was something about the way he positioned himself, like an oak tree with deep roots, unmovable yet flexible. During my years of teaching, Mr. Wilson continued, setting his grocery bags carefully on the ground, I've seen many young people like yourselves, angry at the world, looking for someone to blame for their pain. Brad's face reddened with rage. He wasn't interested in a lecture, especially not from someone he'd marked as a target. Shut up, he shouted, his voice echoing across the empty parking lot. You don't know anything about us. Mike and Derek exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't how their usual harassment typically went. Something about Mr. Wilson's demeanor had changed, and they could feel the shift in the air. Actually, Mr. Wilson replied, I know quite a bit about teaching young people. For 40 years, I ran one of the most respected dojos in the city. Taught thousands of students, many of whom came to me angry, just like you. Brad laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. What, you're trying to tell us you're some kind of karate master? Yeah, right. Mr. Wilson's eyes softened with something like compassion. I'm telling you that there's a better way than this. Violence and hatred only lead to more pain. But Brad had reached his breaking point. The calm wisdom in Mr. Wilson's voice, so similar to his father's disappointed tone, pushed him over the edge. With a shout of rage, he lunged forward, aiming a wild punch at the elderly man's face. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the watching teens. Mr. Wilson's body shifted ever so slightly, moving with the fluid grace of a master martial artist. Brad's punch met empty air as the elderly man seemed to effortlessly glide past the attack. In the same smooth motion, Mr. Wilson's hand gently but firmly redirected Brad's momentum, causing the teenager to stumble forward and nearly lose his balance. How did you? Brad started to say, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. Mr. Wilson stood calmly, his hands now clasped behind his back. The other teens stared in disbelief, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They had just witnessed something that defied their expectations. Their leader's attack had been neutralized without any apparent effort, and more importantly, without any attempt to harm him. Perhaps, Mr. Wilson said quietly, now we can have a real conversation about respect and understanding. The parking lot fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the gentle evening breeze. The teens stood frozen, their worldview suddenly shifted by this revelation. The man they had been tormenting for weeks was not just any elderly resident. He was a master of martial arts who had chosen patience and restraint over retaliation. The next few moments would prove crucial in changing the course of their lives, though none of them realized it yet. The lesson was just beginning. Brad stumbled backward, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He couldn't understand how the elderly man had moved so quickly, or how his attack had been deflected with such ease. His friends stood frozen, their earlier mockery replaced by stunned silence. That was just luck, Brad shouted, trying to salvage his pride. He charged forward again, this time throwing a series of wild punches. Mr. Wilson moved like water, each movement precise and economical. He weaved and redirected Brad's attacks, never once striking back, yet making the teenager's aggression look clumsy and ineffective. Mike stepped forward to help his friend, but Mr. Wilson's voice stopped him. Stay where you are, young man. This is a lesson your friend needs to learn, and you'll all be safer watching from there. The authority in his voice made Mike step back instinctively. Chris and Derek remained rooted to their spots, mesmerized by the display of skill before them. Mr. Wilson's movements were unlike anything they'd seen in action movies or street fights. There was no wasted energy, no flashy techniques, just pure efficiency. Brad, growing increasingly frustrated, attempted a clumsy kick. Mr. Wilson simply shifted his weight, caught Brad's leg, and used the teenager's own momentum to send him sprawling onto the asphalt. The fall wasn't hard enough to cause injury, but it was enough to finally break through Brad's anger. How? Brad gasped, staying down on the ground, his chest heaving. How are you doing this? Mr. Wilson stood over him, but his posture wasn't threatening. Instead, he extended his hand to help Brad up. 40 years of training teaches you that the best victory is the one where nobody gets hurt. Your anger makes you strong, but it also makes you blind. Brad stared at the offered hand for a long moment before accepting it. As Mr. Wilson helped him to his feet, the teenager's face showed confusion rather than anger. For the first time, he was seeing the old man differently, not as a target, but as someone who had just shown him more respect than he deserved. What you just experienced, Mr. Wilson continued, addressing all 4 teens, is called soft power. In martial arts, we learn that the strongest technique isn't always the one that causes the most damage. Sometimes, the strongest move is the one that teaches the best lesson. Chris stepped forward, his voice quiet but curious. Those moves? That was karate? Mr. Wilson nodded, Shotokan karate specifically. I've been practicing since I was younger than you are now. But what I taught wasn't just about fighting. It was about discipline, respect, and understanding. Derek, who had been silent until now, spoke up. You could have hurt Brad just now. You had plenty of chances. Violence only creates more violence, Mr. Wilson replied. I spent my life teaching young people how to defend themselves, yes, but more importantly, how to avoid needing to defend themselves in the first place. Brad stood up straighter, brushing dust off his clothes. The arrogance in his posture was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. Why didn't you do this before? When I was harassing me, Mr. Wilson finished gently, because every student needs to be ready to learn. Sometimes, that readiness only comes after we hit our lowest point. The parking lot fell quiet again, but this time the silence was different. The teenage boys looked at each other, then at their feet, the weight of their previous actions settling on their shoulders. I've seen a lot of angry young men in my dojo over the years, Mr. Wilson continued. Many of them came to me thinking that martial arts would make them tougher, more dangerous. They left understanding that true strength comes from being able to choose peace over violence. He walked over to his grocery bags, which had remained untouched throughout the confrontation. Picking them up, he turned back to the teenagers. The choice is yours now. You can continue down the path you're on, letting anger and prejudice guide you. Or you can choose to learn, to grow, to understand that the color of a person's skin has nothing to do with their worth or their wisdom. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot cast long shadows as Mr. Wilson began walking away. He had taken only a few steps when Brad's voice called out after him. Mr. Wilson? The teenager's voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry. Mr. Wilson turned back, a gentle smile on his face. Tomorrow is a new day, young man. What matters is what you choose to do with it. The following afternoon, Mr. Wilson sat on his front porch, sipping green tea from his favorite ceramic cup. The events from the previous evening had left a lasting impression not just on the teens, but on him as well. He recognized in Brad the same anger he had seen in countless students over his decades of teaching. As he contemplated the quiet street, he noticed Brad approaching alone, walking instead of skateboarding. The teenager's usual confident strut was replaced by hesitant steps. When he reached the front of Mr. Wilson's house, he stood awkwardly at the bottom of the porch steps. Good afternoon, Brad, Mr. Wilson said calmly, setting his tea down. Would you like to join me? Brad climbed the steps slowly and sat in the empty chair next to Mr. Wilson. For several minutes, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and distant lawnmowers. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Brad finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. About anger making people blind. My dad, he left us last year, married his secretary. He paused, struggling with the words. I guess I've been angry at everyone since then. Mr. Wilson nodded, understanding filling his eyes. During the civil rights movement, I saw a lot of hatred, Brad, experienced it firsthand. But my martial arts master taught me something valuable. Hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at his garden. In 1965, I was about your age when a group of white men attacked me outside my school. I could have fought back. I already had my black belt. Instead, I defended myself without hurting them. One of those men later became one of my most dedicated students. Brad listened intently, his usual mask of arrogance completely gone. How did you do it? How did you not hate them? It wasn't easy, Mr. Wilson admitted. But hate is heavy, son. It weighs you down, clouds your judgment. I chose to channel that energy into something positive, teaching others. Over 40 years, I taught thousands of students, many of them carrying the same anger you do. He turned back to face Brad. Would you like to hear about some of them? Brad nodded, and Mr. Wilson shared stories about troubled teens who had found their way through martial arts. He told Brad about a young man who had been involved in gang violence but eventually became a social worker. He spoke about a girl who had faced racial discrimination but went on to open her own successful dojo. As he listened, Brad's expression changed from interest to something deeper, recognition. He saw himself in these stories, saw the possibility of a different path. The first lesson in my dojo was never about fighting, Mr. Wilson explained. It was about respect. Respect for others, respect for yourself. The physical techniques came later. Many students came looking for ways to hurt others but left understanding how to heal themselves. Brad's eyes welled up with tears he tried to hide. I think I need that kind of help. The things I've done, the way I've acted. The past is the past, Mr. Wilson said gently. What matters is what you choose to do now. Change is possible, but it requires courage, sometimes more courage than throwing the punch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, worn business card. Though his dojo had closed years ago, he still carried these as reminders of his teaching days. If you're serious about wanting to learn, I could teach you. Not just karate, but the principles behind it. Brad took the card with trembling hands. What about the others? Mike, Derek, and Chris? They're welcome too, if they're willing to learn. Real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit when we've been wrong and work to make it right. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch, Brad stood up. His posture was different now, not defeated, but humbled. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I need to think about some things. Mr. Wilson nodded, picking up his teacup. Take all the time you need. When you're ready to learn, I'll be here. Brad walked down the porch steps, posing at the bottom. Mr. Wilson, I really am sorry. For everything. I know, son, Mr. Wilson replied softly. I know. As he watched Brad walk away, Mr. Wilson smiled quietly to himself. In his experience, the seeds of change often grew from the most unexpected situations. Sometimes, it took a moment of physical defeat to open the door to spiritual growth. Brad spent the next few days in a state of deep reflection. He'd avoided his friends, staying in his room and looking through old family photo albums. In one dusty box in the attic, he found something that made his heart stop. A photograph of his grandfather in a karate, standing next to a much younger Mr. Wilson. With shaking hands, Brad called his grandfather, who now lived in Florida. When he described Mr. Wilson, his grandfather's voice filled with excitement. James Wilson. He was my sensei back in '85. One of the finest men I've ever known. He taught me more than just karate. He helped me become a better person during some rough times. Brad sat on his bed, phone pressed to his ear, as his grandfather shared stories about training under Mr. Wilson. He learned how his grandfather, struggling with alcohol and anger issues after returning from Vietnam, had found peace and purpose in Mr. Wilson's dojo. But why didn't you ever tell me about him? Brad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end. I tried, Brad. When you were younger, I wanted to take you to his dojo, but your father, he didn't approve of martial arts. Thought it was a waste of time. The revelation hit Brad hard. All this time, he had been harassing someone who had helped shape his own grandfather's life. The shame felt overwhelming. That evening, Brad's mother found him crying in his room. For the first time since the divorce, he opened up to her about everything, his anger, his pain, and now, his regret about how he had treated Mr. Wilson. I've been so stupid, Mom, he sobbed. I've been blaming everyone else for how bad I feel inside. And now I find out that Mr. Wilson, the man I've been tormenting, is the same person who helped Grandpa turn his life around. His mother held him close, letting him release years of pent-up emotions. When he finally calmed down, she shared her own memories of hearing about Mr. Wilson from Brad's grandfather. The next morning, Brad walked to Mike's house, then to Derek's, and finally to Chris's. He showed them the old photograph and told them about his grandfather's connection to Mr. Wilson. His friends listened in stunned silence. "We all messed up," Mike said finally, "but maybe it's not too late to make things right." Chris, who had always been the most hesitant about their bullying, spoke up. "My parents have been talking about getting me into some kind of activity to help with my anxiety. Maybe this is it." Derek nodded slowly. "My little brother's been getting bullied at school. I've been acting just like those bullies, haven't I? Maybe we all need what Mr. Wilson is offering." Together, they walked to Mr. Wilson's house. They found him in his garden, as usual, tending to his flowers. When he saw them approaching as a group, he straightened up slowly, his face neutral but welcoming. Brad stepped forward, holding out the old photograph. "Mr. Wilson, sir, I found this yesterday. This is my grandfather, isn't it? Robert Thompson." Mr. Wilson took the photograph, and for the first time, the teen saw genuine surprise on his face. A warm smile spread across his features as he studied the image. "Bobby Thompson, one of my best students. He had such a fighting spirit, but learned to channel it into something positive." He looked up at Brad. "Now I see where you get it from." "Sir," Brad said, his voice thick with emotion, "we all came to apologize, really apologize, and, if you're still willing to teach us, we want to learn. Not just the karate, but everything else too." Mr. Wilson looked at each teen in turn, seeing the sincerity in their eyes. "The path of martial arts isn't easy," he said. "It requires dedication, humility, and a willingness to face your own weaknesses. Are you ready for that?" The 4 teens nodded, standing straighter under his gaze. "Then we begin tomorrow," Mr. Wilson said. "Be here at 6 a.m. and bring your grandfather's story with you, Brad. Sometimes knowing where we come from helps us understand where we're going." As the teens left, Mr. Wilson watched them go, still holding the old photograph. In their faces, he saw the same potential for transformation that he had seen in Brad's grandfather all those years ago. The cycle of teaching and learning was beginning again. News travels fast in small communities, and the story of what happened in the parking lot spread quickly through Pine Creek. Parents who had previously avoided Mr. Wilson now stopped to chat when they saw him. Children who had once crossed the street began waving hello. One Saturday morning, while Mr. Wilson was teaching the 4 teens their first kata in his converted garage dojo, a knock at the door interrupted their practice. A woman stood there with her young son, who had been a recent victim of bullying at school. "I heard what you did," she said, her eyes moving from Mr. Wilson to the teens practicing in neat rows. "How you turned things around for these boys. My Tommy, he needs something like this." Mr. Wilson welcomed them in, and soon more parents arrived with similar stories. By the end of the week, his private training sessions had grown to include 15 students of various ages and backgrounds. The local newspaper sent a reporter to cover the story. They took photos of Mr. Wilson teaching, with Brad and his friends helping the younger students. The article, titled "From Conflict to Community: How One Man's Patience Changed a Neighborhood," captured the attention of the entire town. Brad's grandfather, after reading the article online, flew in from Florida to visit. The day he walked into the dojo, everyone could see where Brad got his height and build. Watching his grandson help teach a young student brought tears to his eyes. "You haven't changed your teaching style at all, Sensei," he said to Mr. Wilson, bowing respectfully. "Still building bridges where others see walls." The mayor of Pine Creek, impressed by the positive changes in the community, offered Mr. Wilson a vacant building downtown to open a proper dojo. Local businesses, led by Brad's mother's real estate company, pitched in to help with renovation costs. During a town council meeting, Mr. Wilson shared his vision. "This isn't just about teaching martial arts. It's about creating a space where people can learn to understand and respect each other, where the color of your skin, your age, or your background doesn't matter." The transformation in the original 4 teens was remarkable. Brad, once known for his bullying, became a patient mentor to younger students. His anger issues diminished as he focused on helping others. Mike discovered a talent for teaching and began assisting with the children's classes. Derek's younger brother, once a victim of bullying, joined the dojo and found his confidence growing daily. Chris's anxiety improved as he learned breathing techniques and self-defense. Parents reported positive changes at home and school. Teachers noticed improved behavior and focus from students who attended Mr. Wilson's classes. Even local police noted a decrease in teenage-related incidents in the neighborhood. One evening, after class, a group of parents organized a surprise appreciation dinner for Mr. Wilson. The community center was packed with students, parents, and neighbors. The walls were decorated with photos showing the dojo's impact on the community, children of different races practicing together, teenagers helping elderly students, families connecting over shared experiences. During the dinner, Brad stood up to speak. His voice shook slightly as he addressed the crowd. "A few months ago, I was filled with hate and anger. I took it out on a man who had done nothing wrong, except be different from me. But instead of hatred, he showed me wisdom. Instead of punishment, he offered guidance." Mr. Wilson sat quietly, listening as person after person shared stories of how his teachings had affected their lives. The elderly man who had once felt isolated in his new neighborhood now found himself at the heart of a transformed community. As the evening wound down, the mayor announced that the city would be recognizing Mr. Wilson with a Community Service Award. But for Mr. Wilson, the real reward was seeing the changes in his students and the community. Walking home that night, Mr. Wilson passed the spot where the confrontation with Brad had taken place months ago. He smiled, thinking about how one moment of restraint and wisdom had sparked such widespread change. A car slowed beside him, and Brad's mother rolled down the window. "Need a ride, Mr. Wilson?" "Thank you," he replied, "but I enjoy these evening walks. They remind me that every step we take can lead us in a new direction, if we're brave enough to choose the right path." The Pine Creek community had indeed chosen a new path, one that led toward understanding and respect rather than fear and prejudice. And it all began with an elderly man who refused to let hatred win. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the parking lot, and Mr. Wilson's dojo had become the heart of Pine Creek's community. The renovated downtown building buzzed with activity from dawn until dusk, its walls echoing with the sounds of training, laughter, and friendship. Brad, Mike, Chris, and Derek had transformed from neighborhood troublemakers into respected junior instructors. They arrived early each morning to help Mr. Wilson prepare for classes, their white chists now bearing the brown belts they had earned through dedicated training. On a crisp autumn morning, Mr. Wilson gathered his original 4 students before the day's classes began. "When you first came here," he said, watching them sit in perfect Caesar position, "you were looking for different things. Brad, you needed to understand your anger. Mike, you were following others instead of leading. Chris, you were afraid to stand up for what's right. And Derek, you needed to learn that strength isn't about intimidation." The teens nodded, remembering their first days of training. Brad especially had come far, replacing his anger with purpose. He now spent weekends visiting his grandfather in Florida, learning more about the family's connection to martial arts. The dojo had grown to over 100 students, ranging from 5-year-olds to senior citizens. Mr. Wilson had established a scholarship program, ensuring that anyone who wanted to learn could do so, regardless of their financial situation. The program was funded by local businesses, many of whom had witnessed the positive changes in the community. That morning was special. The dojo was hosting its first formal exhibition. Students would demonstrate their progress for their families and the community. The mayor would be there, along with reporters from several local newspapers. As people filled the viewing area, Mr. Wilson watched Brad helping a young black student perfect his kata. The sight brought tears to his eyes as he remembered his own journey from facing racism to teaching unity through martial arts. The exhibition began with the youngest students demonstrating basic moves, their faces serious with concentration. Then came the adult classes, showing self-defense techniques and traditional forms. Finally, the 4 teens took center stage. They performed a synchronized kata that they had practiced for weeks. Their movements were fluid and precise, showing how far they had come from their days of aimless troublemaking. The audience watched in amazement as the former bullies demonstrated the essence of martial arts: discipline, respect, and harmony. After the exhibition, during the celebration, Brad's mother approached Mr. Wilson. "I never thought I'd see my son like this," she said, watching Brad patiently teach a young student. "You didn't just teach him karate, you taught him how to be a better person." The mayor presented Mr. Wilson with a key to the city, but the elderly master's attention was on his students. He saw Chris confidently speaking to a group of parents, Mike organizing the younger students for a group photo, and Derek showing his brother a new technique. Later that evening, as the last students left, the 4 teens stayed behind to help clean up. They found Mr. Wilson sitting in meditation position in the center of the dojo. "Sensei," Brad said softly, "my grandfather is moving back to town. He wants to help teach at the dojo, if you'll have him." Mr. Wilson opened his eyes and smiled. "The circle completes itself. Your grandfather was once where you are now, and soon you'll be where I am." The teens joined him on the floor, sitting in a respectful circle. The setting sun cast long shadows through the dojo's windows, reminding them of that fateful evening 6 months ago. "Each of you has learned that true strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down," Mr. Wilson said. "Remember this lesson as you continue your journey." As they sat there in the quiet dojo, each person reflected on their transformation. The building that had once been empty now held countless stories of change and growth. The neighborhood that had once been divided by prejudice was now united in purpose. Mr. Wilson looked at his students, not just 4 troubled teens anymore, but future leaders who would carry on his legacy of teaching respect, understanding, and compassion through martial arts. The story of the racist teens and the karate master had become something more, a testament to the power of patience, wisdom, and the belief that anyone can change when shown the right path.